Welcome back to my YouTube channel. I still remember the way my brother leaned back in his leather chair, twirling his whiskey glass like he was already a billionaire. I had offered to support his startup, not out of charity, but because I believed in the concept and, admittedly, because he was family. I didn't even get to finish my sentence before he laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not confusion, pure mockery. "We don't need your pocket change," he said, grinning at our mother like we were sharing some inside joke about me. The words stung more because of how casually he threw them out, as if I were a child interrupting grown-ups. My mother didn't correct him. She nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line, and said, "This is serious business. Let the professionals handle it. Professional." That word echoed louder than his laughter. To them, I was still the girl who started a cute little business from her laptop, someone who made side money, and should be grateful for being invited into rooms they believed I didn't belong in. They didn't ask how much I was offering. They didn't ask why I was interested. They just dismissed me, like I was bringing loose coins to a boardroom table. I didn't fight back. I didn't list my credentials or mention the companies I'd already funded. I didn't correct their assumptions or remind them that the only reason I'd stayed quiet all these years was because silence lets people expose themselves. Instead, I simply smiled. Not because I wasn't hurt, but because I'd already learned the power of letting people underestimate me. Their arrogance wasn't my burden, it was my strategy. And while they strutted around with borrowed pride and untested confidence, I was making decisions behind doors they didn't even know existed. That day, in that room full of smug certainty, I realized something important. They weren't rejecting my offer. They were confirming their blindness, and blindness always has a price. They thought they knew everything about me because they knew my past. They remembered the girl who used to design logos for local boutiques just to pay rent. The one who shared a cramped apartment with 2 roommates and drove a second-hand Honda with a broken AC. What they never bothered to notice was that I outgrew that version of myself years ago. While my brother was busy pitching to anyone who would listen, I was quietly learning how money moves, how startups rise and fall, and how to spot the difference between confidence and competence. I invested in people before they became headlines. I said yes to founders no one else believed in. I learned to listen before speaking, observe before acting, and build in silence before showing the world anything. The first time a CEO called me, "The reason we're still standing," I realized I didn't need credit to have power. The first time a company I funded got acquired, I realized I didn't need applause to feel proud. And the first time a founder introduced me to another as someone whose yes can change your life, I realized I had become exactly what no one in my family imagined I could be: necessary. They never asked about the companies I backed. They assumed the money I made came from some lucky break or a trending product. They never wondered how I traveled so freely, bought property without loans, or helped a friend launch her tech platform with cash instead of advice. They thought I lived comfortably. They had no idea I lived strategically. The irony is that my brother's startup landed on my desk months before he even mentioned it to the family. I heard about it through a pitch deck forwarded to my team by one of his co-founders. They didn't know he was my brother, and I didn't mention it. I read the deck, skimmed the projections, and noted one thing. It had potential, but not in his hands alone. When my investment group expressed interest, I gave quiet approval. Not because of him, but because of the product and the people building it behind him. He wasn't the reason investors were circling. He was simply the loudest person in the room taking credit for their work. I watched him post about major deals coming soon and big names backing us, knowing full well my signature sat on more documents in his company than his own. It was almost amusing how loudly he performed success while being funded by people he wouldn't even make eye contact with at family dinner. I could have told him then. I could have said, "You don't know it, but I'm already in your cap table." But ego needs space to reveal itself fully before it can be corrected. So I let him brag. I let him dismiss me. I let him believe I was on the outside looking in. All the while, I was watching from the inside, waiting to see if he'd treat me with respect even without knowing who I was to him professionally. He failed that test in record time. The day he announced he had secured a major investor was the first time I'd seen him look genuinely proud in years. He came to Sunday dinner wearing that smug, inflated confidence that always preceded some dramatic reveal. He didn't sit down right away. Instead, he stood at the head of the table like he was about to deliver a presidential address. "I just closed a $40 million deal," he said, pausing for dramatic effect. Mom gasped like she'd just heard angels sing. My father, who usually kept his emotions under lock and key, actually clapped. I just kept buttering my bread. He went on and on about the investor, calling them a private equity powerhouse and a strategic partner with deep pockets. He described meetings at glass-walled offices, contract negotiations that lasted nights, and plans for expansion that sounded like they were lifted from a magazine article about unicorn startups. Not once did he mention the team that made the product viable. Not once did he acknowledge the co-founders who stayed up coding while he crafted LinkedIn posts. And certainly not once did he imagine that the powerhouse investor was his younger sister, the one he told to sit this out. Mom beamed like she'd raised a prodigy. "This is what I meant," she said, glancing my way, not even trying to hide the comparison. "Real investors see his potential. This is serious scale, not small family favors." I sipped my water and let her words hang between us. Across the table, my brother winked at me like he'd just won some unspoken competition. He joked about how he'd save me a position in his company one day, maybe something in branding. Since I liked that creative stuff, he said it loud enough for everyone to hear, and the table laughed with him. What none of them knew was that my signature had already been on the paperwork for weeks. The deal he was bragging about had been finalized after I reviewed it with my legal team. The capital transfer had gone through accounts I controlled. The co-founders had thanked me personally in conference calls he never attended. My name wasn't on the press release, that was intentional. I didn't need a spotlight. I needed leverage, and I had it. My investment wasn't emotional. It was calculated. I didn't do it to prove anything to him. I did it because I believed in the product, the team behind it, and the market timing. But his arrogance? His refusal to even consider me as a peer, let alone as someone capable of contributing? That was a variable he didn't account for. I watched him toast to his future, watched my mother glow with pride, watched my father nod in approval. They thought the story was about him. They didn't realize they were only reading the cover. The call came on a Thursday morning. While he was in the middle of a team meeting he'd orchestrated mostly to impress a new advisor. His phone buzzed on the table and he silenced it the first time. Then it rang again. And again. 3 calls back to back from an unknown number labeled only with the bank's name. His co-founders glanced at each other, uneasy, but he held up a finger and smirked like he was too important to be interrupted. When it rang the 4th time, he answered with exaggerated irritation, putting it on speaker so everyone could hear how in control he was. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, and direct. "Good morning, sir. I'm calling with an urgent update regarding your Series A funding. Your lead investor has initiated a full withdrawal of the $40 million previously allocated to your company. The transfer reversal is in motion. We are legally required to inform you immediately." The room froze. For a moment, he didn't process the words. He blinked, laughed awkwardly, and said, "There must be a mistake. That money's already committed." His voice cracked on the word committed. The banker didn't waver. "The investor signed final authorization this morning. Effective immediately, the funds are being reclaimed and the agreement is null." His co-founders stared at him, speechless. One of them muttered something about payroll and vendor contracts. Another pulled out his laptop so fast the charger nearly ripped from the wall. The advisor who'd joined just last week quietly stood and walked out of the room without a word. His face changed slowly, like someone draining the color from a painting. His jaw tightened, his nostrils flared, and for the first time in his life, he looked like he understood the fragility of his position. There was no speech to give, no ego big enough to climb behind. He ended the call without saying goodbye. Minutes later, he called my mother. I know because she showed up at my place unannounced, breathless, rattled, still in her nightgown under a coat. She didn't scold, didn't accuse. She just stood in my doorway and said his world was collapsing and no one knew why. I listened. I made tea. I let her pace circles in my living room while she speculated about shady investors, contractual loopholes, incompetent lawyers, and bad faith deals. She never once considered that the person who pulled the plug might be someone who didn't need to threaten or warn or explain. She definitely didn't think it could be me. But the truth was simple. I didn't do it to ruin him. I did it to remind him. Power without respect is just noise. And he'd been loud for far too long. When he finally came to see me, he didn't knock like a brother. He knocked like a man who'd run out of exits. His shoulders sagged in a way I'd never seen. His confidence, usually loud enough to fill a room before he did, was nowhere in sight. I opened the door and just looked at him. He didn't speak right away. He stepped inside, glanced around like he was standing in unfamiliar territory, and for once, didn't assume he belonged there. He sat on the edge of the couch, elbows on his knees, hands clasped like someone waiting for a verdict. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. They pulled everything. 40 million. Gone overnight. No warning. No explanation. I didn't react. I didn't comfort him. I didn't offer theories the way he used to do when he wanted to sound smart. I waited. He tried to laugh it off at first, out of habit more than humor. The bank won't even tell me who authorized it. They said the investor has that right. I didn't even know they could just take it back. I almost felt pity in that moment, not for his loss, but for his realization. He'd built his self-worth on being untouchable. Now he was faced with the fact that the power he flaunted never actually belonged to him. He looked up at me then, confusion and bruised ego swirling behind his eyes. You knew I was working on this for years. Why didn't you warn me not to rely on one investor? I smiled, not out of malice, but clarity. I did offer to be part of it. You said you didn't need my pocket change. He froze. The silence stretched long enough for understanding to land. I watched as the dots connected in his mind one by one. He replayed scenes in reverse. My offer, the dismissal, the smirk, our mother's comment, the bragging at dinner, the timing of the withdrawal. His mouth parted slightly as the truth settled in, heavy and inescapable. You, he said, not quite a question. His posture shifted, not angry, not shocked, but something closer to humbled disbelief. He stared at me like he was seeing a stranger and a mirror at the same time. I didn't confirm or deny. I didn't need to. What people think of you is their story. What you choose to do with your power is yours. I stood, and he followed without being asked. At the door, he hesitated again, but this time there was no arrogance left to hide behind. Just a man realizing the person he dismissed was the one holding the safety net he didn't know he was standing on. And while the world may never know my name in his story, he will never forget it in his reality. I didn't owe him revenge, and I didn't crave his apology. What I wanted, what I had always wanted, was respect without having to set myself on fire to get it. He didn't need me to destroy his company. He needed me to show him the difference between noise and influence. 2 days after he left my house, his co-founders reached out to me directly. They'd figured it out, not because I announced it, but because real leaders pay attention to the details ego ignores. They asked if I was still willing to back the company, with new terms, and without him holding reins he hadn't earned. I told them I'd consider it. Not because of blood, but because of vision. My mother tried to call 3 times before she worked up the courage to say the words she'd avoided all her life. I didn't know. I didn't bother replying with blame. You don't correct people by arguing. You rewrite their assumptions by outgrowing them. I didn't salvage his pride, but I did something better. I gave him silence to sit with. Silence reveals who you are when applause and excuses disappear. He had built his identity on being the one others depended on. Now he knew what it felt like to depend on someone he underestimated. One signature ended the funding. Another could restore it. The difference was never his ability. It was his attitude. And that's the truth most people miss. Power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it declines an invitation, smiles through an insult, then moves billions without raising its voice. So I didn't tell him whether I'd reinvest. Not that day, not with words. But I did look him in the eye before he left and said evenly, next time you think someone's offer is too small to matter, make sure you can afford to lose them. He nodded once, not in agreement, but in awakening. People love to brag about who believed in them. They never tell the story of who could have buried them quietly, and chose not to. And that is the moment I finally understood. Being underestimated isn't a weakness. It's cover. It's leverage. It's strategy. Let them laugh at what they think you are, so you can move freely as what they'll never see coming.